The changing of the goalposts that you mentioned earlier, where the Fed cut 50 basis points right before the election, 50 basis points right after the election. What was different was we have a new president, a new administration, and the tariffs came in. And I think even you, back in January, in your op-ed piece for the Washington Post, pointed out that, look, the Fed's job is to make sure that the tariffs don't turn into an inflationary pressure.
I think that's right. I believe that. But here's what's happened. The Fed now says, well, we'll make a decision about interest rate cuts depending on whether prices of goods in the next month or two go up. Well, what that's really saying is they must be doubting their own inflation-fighting credibility. If they were a very credible central bank, they could say, we're looking past this one-off change in prices. And so their hesitancy to cut rates, I think, is actually quite a mark against them. It's as if they've lost some of the credibility. Truth is, in economics and inflation, bygones are not bygones, Becky. The specter of the miss they made on inflation, it is stuck with them. So one of the reasons why the president, I think, is right to be pushing the Fed publicly is we need regime change in the conduct of policy. And I hear from Andrew, I heard from another speaker that was on, well, will the new Fed chairman, regardless of who it is, will he have credibility because the president's being so mean and pushing them around? The credibility deficit lies with the incumbents that are at the Fed, in my view.
Well, let me ask you a related question then. So we saw yesterday David Solomon, we also saw Brian Moynihan came on, and they said, look, the independence of the Fed is critical. The market, the global investing community needs to believe that whoever's running the Fed and everybody involved in it is independent from the president. That's conceptually. Do you agree with that idea? And then if that's true, and this is a sort of very interesting sort of behavioral science sort of experiment, to some degree, whoever gets this job is going to obviously be appointed by the president, so they're connected to them in some way. But at the same time, as Nick was saying, and maybe you'll disagree with Nick said that person needs to somehow demonstrate to the market that they're independent of the Fed, otherwise they won't have the credibility.
So I hate to agree with Nick, but I guess I have to agree on one small part here. The good news is I have a track record. I have a track record going back 20 years, including in the darkest days of the financial crisis at the Fed. The track record makes me understand who's really talented at the Fed and who do we need to elevate, and who is sort of holding on to 1978 models who we need to relegate. Credibility comes through tough times. In the 2008 financial crisis, books that you wrote about with all this outrage, I can't find anyone at the Fed who was more aggressive in trying to get to the bottom of that and pushing radical new things that you might even describe as dovish. In the 2020 pandemic came, there was a huge shutdown to the economy. A month before Chairman Powell and the group over there said, well, maybe we should be cutting rates, I spoke and wrote vociferously that the U.S. should be leading an international effort to cut rates. They were slow there. In 2018, Jay Powell and his band of brothers put out dots that they were going to continue to raise rates through a market meltdown. I said they were out of their minds. They ended up cutting. So I think experience does help. Experience means there are times to be dovish and times to be hawkish. I'll give you one example of a time to be hawkish. 2021, 2022, interest rates were zero. The Fed was buying $100 billion of assets every month. Payrolls were going up by 500,000. Congress was spending $5 trillion. And what did this group say? This group then said it's all transitory. So I don't know. There's a time for a bird to change his feathers, and it's with the times. It has nothing to do with who's president.
Anyone ever said just shut up, listen, and learn? That because I said that to myself before you started. But you know, for anyone that's Kevin wants to cut rates now because he wants a job. I mean, you just put out a sort of a dissertation on what your feelings are. That totally, for me at least, you explained yourself fully. I don't know if you get the job, but after listening to that, I'm ready to at least say you should be seriously considered. That was a master class.
Well, listen, I appreciate it, but this isn't actually about one person. This isn't about getting a job. I mean, what I just harangued Andrew about, that might be the greatest hits. These have been my views since the beginning of time.
The classic thing, Kevin, is President Trump, whatever his reasons are, he wants to cut rates. It could be because he's a real estate guy. but somehow you two arrive at kind of the same conclusion, maybe from totally different places.
Yeah,
but if you're right, you're right.
I'll say two things about that. One is we created the second monetary instrument called quantitative easing in the darkest days of the '08 financial crisis. It's a second monetary policy tool. When we created it, we had cut rates to zero, so we said we're going to start buying all these bonds and all these mortgages from Fannie and Freddie. Now, if you listen to the Powell Fed, they say, oh, that big balance sheet, that has nothing to do with monetary policy. The real reason why we can begin reform at the Fed with a rate cut, which is just a first step to regime change, is if you look outside this window, financial markets, financial conditions, they are hot. IPO markets are back. Credit spreads are narrow. SPACs are back. Financial conditions are very loose here. What about the real economy? It's the real economy I talked to Ken Langone about. We're near a housing recession. Real households, first-time home buyers, small businesses, they're having a hard time getting credit. So at the same time, what can we do? Take a little of this looseness out of financial markets by getting the Fed out of the fiscal business, out of the political business, shrink that, and then redeploy some of that liquidity to people that need it most in the real economy. I think the Fed has the balance wrong. A rate cut is the beginning of the process to get the balance right. A strong real economy is what we need, so this can be a golden age.
You know, I was thinking about what you said about AI and the productivity gains we're expected to see and why that is part of the reason. And it reminds me of the other side of the Fed's mandate, which is full employment. Do you worry that the productivity gains that we see in AI will lead to a much weaker jobs market? You look at Microsoft or any of these companies that are talking about how they can do a lot of this work with fewer people at this point.
Yeah, so the amazing thing about this revolution, I think, is it's coming very quickly. In that ways, it's a little different than the internet or cloud or even the combustion engine.
Yeah, far different than the Industrial Revolution.
So I'm very open-minded about the speed of the change here. But I'll say something else. I think humans are underrated. I think humans have this incredible adaptability. If you look at the things that we all call work, 50 years ago, they wouldn't have considered any of this real work. What will be real work in 10 or 20 years will be different. So if there's a thing that bothers me about this speed of the transition, it's not that the U.S. will fall behind. The U.S. is going to be at the forefront of this. The relative growth between the U.S. economy and the economies around the world will widen. The president is right. The U.S. will be a big winner. My own judgment is this will be America's century again because of these policies and because these technologies are born here. I think that's all true. But if you said to me, what's a lagging worry? Technology is moving up and to the right. The K-12 education system is moving down and to the right. We need to make sure that these tools can be plugged into the most talented young people, regardless of where they are, so that they can achieve great outcomes. And the educational system, I would say, is an Achilles heel. That's why the work that Secretary McMahon and others are doing are so essential.